Home alone and an uninvited guest. George lived alone in her house in a small Michigan town on weekends. She often came here to escape the urban lifestyle she had grown up in and had grown tired of. She enjoyed the peaceful countryside, but George's house was like something out of a horror movie, an old house with overgrown grass and peeling paint. One Friday, George had just arrived home. She sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the TV, relaxing after a long week at work. As she flipped through channels, her peace was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. At first, George ignored it, thinking it wasn't important. But the knocking grew louder and more persistent. George opened the door and saw a man standing there, holding a clipboard. She immediately assumed he was selling something. He asked her if she was satisfied with her security system. George replied that she didn't have one but wasn't too concerned, joking that no one would break into such an ugly house. He then went on to describe all the recent break-ins in the area, which, honestly, George had never heard of. He then asked who George lived with, and she accidentally blurted out that she lived alone. Although she wasn't interested, he persistently asked for her phone number at least. He said he'd follow up in a few weeks and even offered free installation on the spot. After some back and forth, George agreed since it sounded like a good deal. He thanked her and left. Later, George went to the kitchen to start cooking dinner and then continued watching movies in the living room. She binge-watched for hours on the couch until around 11 p.m. when there was a knock at the door. This time, it was hard to ignore. George glanced at the clock, worried. 11 p.m. was far too late for anyone to knock on the door, especially since she wasn't close with her neighbors. The knocking persisted. She cautiously approached the door and asked who was there, but there was no response. Thinking quickly, she lied that she had a gun, though she didn't. She hoped it would scare them off. For a moment, the knocking stopped, but then her phone rang. When she answered, the voice on the other end claimed to be from 911, saying there was a dangerous intruder in her house, and they needed to come in to handle him. They said they were standing at her door, but she was skeptical. George looked around and saw nothing unusual. Meanwhile, the knocking outside continued relentlessly. She unlocked one of the latches and hesitantly placed her hand on the doorknob. But before she could react, the door somehow opened. It wasn't a police officer like the caller claimed. It was him, the delivery man from earlier. His demeanor was erratic and strange, his eyes wide, no longer resembling a salesperson. Then he said,
"You shouldn't let yourself be tricked like that. Your house really is run down, but to let your guard down like this? I think you need me."
He smiled cheerfully, as if nothing had happened before. George had no idea what the hell was going on. He started telling her that his car had broken down, and he asked for a cup of hot water, saying he'd leave right after. But his expression was off. It was bad enough that she really thought he might be a burglar. Reluctantly, she went to get the water while he sat waiting in the living room. After finishing the water, he left, thanking her for the drink. She sighed in relief and moved to close the door. But as she tried to close it, his arm blocked it. A strong shove flung the door back open. She asked,
"Did you forget something? Don't joke like that."
But no, he was slowly advancing, grinning maliciously. Instinctively, George backed away and ran into the kitchen. He chased her into the kitchen, laughing gleefully.
"You should have been more careful. Watching you scared is so entertaining."
Then he immediately went to the knife rack and grabbed one. He swung it through the air, narrowly missing, but it grazed her sleeve, leaving George injured and in pain. Panicked, unsure of what he wanted, she ran to the front door. But when she got there, George tripped and fell while he stood over her, knife in hand. Then her eyes caught sight of a mini fire extinguisher near the door. She grabbed it and sprayed it into his face, disorienting him. She grabbed the keys hanging nearby, ran outside, got into her car, and sped off in terror. Once she reached a safe distance, she called the real police to track him down. He was eventually apprehended, and it turned out the man wasn't a random intruder, but someone who had been stalking her. He had faked the 911 call, knowing she would open the door. That night would stay with her forever, but she remained grateful to be alive. George swore to herself that no one would ever trick her into opening the door again. The ghost of the police station. When I was a child, I lived with my parents and younger brother in a large, old house. I didn't know it held hidden secrets behind its walls. At first, everything seemed perfect, but there was something deeply unsettling about the place. It all started when I couldn't sleep in one particular room. As a child, I cried incessantly until my parents decided to move me to another room, leaving that bedroom for my brother. Years passed, and by the time I was 5, the nightmares began. They weren't ordinary nightmares. They were terrifying. There was always someone visiting me in my sleep. Sometimes a woman in a white dress standing ominously at the foot of my bed. Sometimes a man dressed as a policeman, keeping me from sleeping peacefully. The man, in particular, stood out. He always wore a policeman's uniform riddled with bullet holes. Every night, he would chase me, and I had no idea why. In my dreams, I would run, but no matter how fast I ran, he was always right behind me. I screamed for help, but couldn't make a sound. Night after night, I was trapped in nightmares, and even when I woke up, it wasn't over. I could still feel his presence in the room. Some nights, he wouldn't chase me in my dreams anymore. Instead, it became disturbingly real. He would stand at the foot of my bed, grinning grotesquely and staring at me, his empty gaze piercing through my soul. I lay frozen, tears streaming down my face, helpless as his grotesque face came closer and closer, staring straight into my eyes. It wasn't just me, my parents were also exhausted from the sleepless nights. My mother always tried to reassure me, but in those moments, I could see him standing there, right behind my mother, staring and grinning maliciously. Of course, my mother couldn't see him. The worst part was that even when I was awake, I could feel him somewhere in the house. His presence followed me everywhere, a shadow clinging to my every step. I can feel him behind me as I run down the stairs, his breath on my neck. I start to run to escape it, but I can't shake this feeling. As a teenager, I finally opened up to my mother, recounting every detail about the terrifying figure who had haunted me for years. Her face turned pale as I spoke. She told me something that sent chills down my spine. She said that in the 1930s, this house used to be a police station, a place where justice and tragedy often went hand in hand. It was haunted by the spirit of an officer who was not a friendly person in life. When he died, his spirit returned to the building and refused to leave. It turned out that his office was the room I couldn't sleep in as a child. It's now my brother's bedroom. My mother had also sensed him, felt his presence, and she told me, "Your brother has seen him too," and what he told me afterward sent chills down my spine. Last year, when my brother was 16, the man appeared and yelled at him to get out of his office. My brother, strangely calm as if they were old friends, replied, "No, this will be my room now. You're dead. Why don't you leave?" What shocked me was that my brother told me the man's demeanor changed after that conversation. Over time, his attitude softened, and they even had short conversations now and then. I was stunned. My brother had lived with this terrifying presence for years, yet he kept it all to himself. I asked him why he never told anyone. He simply said he knew no one would believe him. Eventually, we moved out when my sister was born. The new house was free of ghosts, and I was relieved to leave that nightmare behind after 8 long years. But what about my brother? For the first 2 years in the new house, the man continued to visit him. But now he was different, no longer frightening, just a shadow at the edge of the room, silently watching. My brother said he no longer sees the man and believes he has finally found peace. Hearing that, I felt an incredible sense of relief. The nightmare was over. The man had moved on. But to this day, my brother and I still see spirits. None, however, have ever frightened me like the man from the police station. The eccentric person on the bus. The cold and quiet night in a small town. Bella often took the bus to get to her workplace. Every day, Bella waited at the same bus stop, quietly watching the world pass by while sipping her coffee. One evening, as usual, she waited for the bus to return home. But there was a man who caught her attention, sending a slight chill down her spine. A man in his 30s, disheveled hair, unshaven, boarded the bus after her. He sat a few rows behind her, but she could feel his eyes on her, though she didn't dare turn around. There was something strange about his presence. Every day on the bus, that man reappeared, always boarding right after her, and his strange behavior began. At first, he walked by and left behind a crude and eerie doll, saying, "This is for you," a gift, before quickly walking away. Bella found it odd and didn't pick it up, ignoring it and moving to another spot out of fear. Sometimes, he would mumble to himself in faint, incomprehensible whispers. Bella grew increasingly uncomfortable, but brushed it off, chalking it up to just an eccentric man. After all, he was just another bus passenger. As days passed without seeing him, she began to feel relieved, thinking she might have overreacted. One evening, Bella sat in her usual spot near the back of the bus. As the bus passed a stop, she saw a familiar figure. She froze, unable to believe her eyes. Then he boarded the bus. She avoided looking at him, pretending not to notice. She sighed in relief as he walked past, but her relief didn't last long as he doubled back and sat right next to her, despite plenty of empty seats around. She didn't dare move. He didn't look directly at Bella, but occasionally glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Then, suddenly, he turned his head toward her, locking eyes with her for a brief moment. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and hollow, sending chills down Bella's spine. At the next stop, he said nothing, simply placed a small piece of paper in her hand and got off the bus immediately, leaving her stunned. Throughout the ride, I didn't dare to open it. When I finally did, curiosity got the better of me. The note read, "I will follow you." Bella's heart raced as she hastily got off the bus. Bella hurriedly stepped off the bus and started walking faster, but then she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, no one was there. As soon as she entered her room, she locked all the doors and pulled the curtains tight, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But then, from the window, she saw his figure lurking at the edge of the road, watching her. She couldn't tell if it was real or just her imagination driven by fear. The next day, Bella took a different route to work, avoiding buses entirely. But paranoia crept in. She began to feel like someone resembling the man from the bus was watching her from alleys, observing her from afar. Then the nightmare struck. A cold hand grabbed her wrist. Startled, she turned around in shock to see him, the man who had been following her from the bus. He gripped her tightly and said in a chilling voice, "You don't need to be scared. I just want to make sure you're safe." Bella was too terrified to think, only desperate to escape. She screamed, "Let me go," but it didn't change anything. His eyes were locked onto hers, unblinking. Luckily, Bella had prepared for the worst. She pulled a can of pepper spray from her pocket and sprayed it into his face, leaving him writhing in pain and temporarily blinded. Terrified, she ran without looking back and collapsed at a small roadside diner nearby, seeking help. He was apprehended shortly after being reported. He confessed that his obsession with Bella stemmed from her uncanny resemblance to his late girlfriend, who had died in a bus accident he couldn't prevent. He was diagnosed with PTSD, and seeing Bella on the bus had triggered his obsession. The man was later admitted to a facility for treatment. Bella, though still haunted by the events, found solace in knowing that the man wasn't truly a threat, but a broken soul lost in his past. But after all, everything had finally come to an end. The Bloody Delivery. A quiet, secluded suburban neighborhood with winding streets and houses far apart. My name is Nick, and I'm just a pizza delivery guy trying to make a living. Tonight is cold and rainy, the kind of night where windshield wipers have to work overtime. I've been driving these streets for months now, delivering pizzas to people who barely acknowledge me. It's just a job, nothing special. But tonight, I stopped at the same old house. The house that always orders pizza at the strangest hours. It's so remote and isolated. It feels like it belongs to another universe. I've been here so many times I've lost count, but there's always been something off about it. I parked in front of the isolated house at the edge of town, stopping at the end of the gravel driveway, headlights illuminating the crumbling porch. The house looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. Overgrown grass, dusty windows, darkened by old curtains swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped up to the front door, knocking on the heavy wooden frame that echoed loudly. For a moment, nothing. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her faint smile barely lighting up her pale face, illuminated by dim light from inside. Yet her eyes were distant, unfocused, shadowed. "Here's your pizza," I said cheerfully, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. She reached out for the pizza box, her hand extending. But something about her hand caught my eye. As I handed it to her, I noticed bruises, dark, swollen marks on her pale skin, as if they'd been there for days. I froze for a second, standing there, unsure if I should say something, but decided against it. I quickly withdrew my hand and forced a smile. "Thanks," she mumbled, almost robotic, before pulling the pizza box inside and shutting the door. I got back in my car and sat for a moment, thinking. The rain kept pouring, and the world outside felt heavy. I couldn't shake the image of her trembling hand as she took the pizza box from me. But I drove away, trying to push it out of my mind. It was just a strange coincidence, I told myself. Weeks passed. Same routine. I delivered pizza to the same house every few days. I started to feel uneasy, my curiosity growing. One evening, after handing her the pizza, I hesitated and asked, "Excuse me? May I ask something?" But the woman only smiled faintly, shook her head, and closed the door, leaving me unsettled. Each time, the bruises and scratches on her hands seemed worse, this time even on her face, as if they had just healed and then reappeared. My instincts told me something was very wrong. Tonight, there was no regular order, but then I noticed something strange, a note hastily written in black ink taped to the door. It read, "Deliver to the back door. Knock 3 times, hard." I followed the instructions. This time, it wasn't her but a man. He stood there, bloodshot eyes, clearly intoxicated, his breath reeking of alcohol. He didn't say a word, just glared at me. I instinctively stepped back, trying to keep calm. He reached for the pizza box, snatched it from my hands, stepped inside and slammed the door shut. I left quickly. One evening, I drove past the house again, not to deliver this time, just passing by after my shift. My curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the house. In the second-floor window, a figure appeared behind the curtain, flashing a light 3 times, repeatedly, over and over. But then, I saw the shadow of a man behind her, raising his hand as if ready to strike. I froze for a moment. I sat in my car, unable to take my eyes off the house. Something inside me told me I needed to go back. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't ignore it. She needed help. After some thought, I returned to the house, planning to make up an excuse, saying it was a promotional gift for loyal customers. I felt I needed to see the woman again to make sure she was okay. The woman opened the door to pay, her eyes darting down to her hand as if she was deciding whether to say something. I followed her gaze. Then, her hand slowly moved down in an unusual way. She folded her thumb into her palm, then folded all her fingers down. At first, I didn't understand, but then I remembered learning about warning signals. It was the SOS hand signal for help. Before I could react or ask her what was happening, the man appeared behind her and shoved her back. He was still drunk, stumbling toward me with a dark, menacing expression. This time, his face had a fresh scratch, and his clothes were smeared with something unidentifiable, speckled with tiny dark spots. The man looked disoriented, his bloodshot eyes moving sluggishly. He mumbled something incoherent and slammed the door shut. At that moment, I froze in hesitation, unsure if this was my responsibility and whether I was putting myself in danger. Just as I was about to leave, the woman screamed from inside the house. "Help! Please!" Her voice was filled with fear. I dropped the pizza box, instincts kicking in, and rushed through the door without hesitation, quickly moving into the house. I knew a bit about self-defense. I had trained in martial arts for situations like this. As I stepped inside, a scene of chaos unfolded. It was horrifying. She was pinned to the floor, struggling under the man's weight, her face wet with tears, and her hands partially bound. Before I could move, the man charged at me in a fit of rage. But I anticipated the attack, ducked low, and countered with a strong strike to his side, sending him crashing to the floor in pain. Seizing the moment, I pinned him to the floor and used the rope he was tying the woman with to restrain him temporarily, long enough to keep him away from her. He was arrested shortly after, and the truth behind that house came to light. Her name was Angela. The man was her ex-husband. The two had gone through a court-ordered divorce. After she refused to reconcile with him, he kidnapped and tortured her, planning to force her into submission. His recent behavior was the result of a psychotic episode. His obsession turned deadly when she tried to escape. After the incident, I decided to quit my job, unwilling to continue such a dangerous line of work. Angela is now living a happy life with her daughter and her new husband. Stranger in the dark. My family was excited about the trip to my aunt's house. I had always looked forward to spending time with my cousin Luca, my closest companion. We arrived at my aunt's house, surrounded by towering trees. Luca rushed outside, her face lighting up when she saw us. After a while, we headed to the nearby store, eager to grab snacks for movie night. We excitedly filled our hands with treats. As we were about to walk home, a man called out to us. I turned around to see a well-dressed man holding a bag of chips. He smiled warmly, and instinctively, I moved closer. The man handed me the bag of chips, and his friendly demeanor put me at ease. I thanked him and walked away without giving it much thought. Night fell, and the atmosphere in the house changed. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by snacks, as we prepared to watch a movie. Suddenly, A faint sound echoed through the house, sending a shiver down my spine. I exchanged a worried glance with Luca, asking if she had locked the door. She hesitated, unsure, and decided to check. The weight felt unbearable as I stood there. My anxiety grew, and I got up to see why she was taking so long. As I stepped into the hallway, my heart stopped. Luca was lying unconscious on the floor, and a masked man was standing next to her. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. I staggered back, feeling paralyzed with fear. The man noticed me and rushed forward. I turned and ran toward the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it just as I heard him pounding on it. I glanced back at the door, the man's pounding echoing in my ears. I couldn't leave Luca behind, even though fear gripped me. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed a plate from the kitchen rack. When the noise outside stopped, I slowly opened the door for a peek. Suddenly, the door burst open, knocking me back. I managed to swing the plate toward him in desperation. It shattered on his head, fragments flying everywhere. Blood streamed from the wound as he staggered back, dazed. I rushed into the kitchen, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone. I tried to dial for help, but I couldn't press the buttons. I was too shaken, not knowing what to do. I ran to check on Luca. I splashed water on her face, and after a moment she woke up. Confusion replacing her unconscious state. Relief washed over me, but I knew we weren't safe yet. When I heard the man stirring, a cold wave of fear swept over me. I couldn't let him find us. I whispered to Luca that we needed to hide. We crept into the kitchen and hid behind the counter. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. I peeked out and saw him searching for us, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's hunger. Fear suffocated me as I gripped Luca's hand tightly. I heard him coming closer, his footsteps making my stomach churn. The sound stopped, and for a moment, silence blanketed the house. Then the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. Suddenly, I shuddered as a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I turned around, and it was Luca, her eyes wide with fear. I could barely see the silhouette of the man in the darkness. Instinctively, I crept forward again, pulling Luca toward the back door, where the faint moonlight streamed in. We dashed outside, running frantically toward the trees that surrounded my aunt's property. We heard the man's laughter echoing through the trees, sending chills down my spine. We spotted a narrow path ahead, leading deeper into the woods. We had no other choice. The path opened up to a cliff overlooking a dark abyss. Panic surged inside me. There was nowhere left to run. Luca and I slowly backed away, but the man kept coming closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to reason with him, my voice trembling. He lunged at us, and instinctively, I pushed Luca aside. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and held it out, ready to defend us. The man laughed, unfazed by my feeble weapon. He lunged again, but this time I dodged to the side. In the chaos, the man stumbled, losing his balance at the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to slow as I watched him teeter on the brink, his expression shifting from confidence to panic. He flailed, reaching out into the air. With one last gasp, he slipped and fell off the cliff, his scream fading into the night. Luca and I stood frozen, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. We looked at each other, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Finally, we followed the path back home. We rushed back home, locking the door behind us. I collapsed onto the chair, trembling, while Luca sat next to me, her eyes wide in disbelief. I realized the gravity of everything and decided to call the police about the horrifying events. I felt grateful because just a little more, and we could have lost everything. The Curse of the Doll. The sun was setting as Claw walked home alone. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, dressed in tattered clothes, approaching her. The woman approached Clara, extending her hand which held an old, creepy-looking doll. What was strange was that the doll's head was tilted at an odd, unnatural angle, with a deep crack running down its body. At first, Clara intended to walk past, but something compelled her to stop. She gave the woman a few coins, and the doll was pressed into her hands before the woman left immediately. Clara returned to her apartment, the doll in her hands. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but dismissed it as just the chill of the night air. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was completely unaware of the faint, soft footsteps following her. Claw held the doll up. Its lifeless eyes stared blankly, as if looking right through her. An uneasy feeling washed over her as she grasped its broken body and placed it on a high shelf before turning away. That night, Claw lay in bed. She tried to sleep, slowly turning onto her side. And right there, beside her pillow, was the doll, its broken neck tilted to one side. Its eyes stared hauntingly at her. She snatched it up and tossed it aside. The next morning, before heading to work, Claw paid little mind to it. She picked it up, glanced at it for a moment, then temporarily set the doll on the sofa. However, when she returned that evening, she found the doll in an odd position. Unexplainably, it was sitting on her bed in her bedroom, even though Claw had closed the door beforehand. She was certain she had left it in the living room. Claw furrowed her brow, glancing around her apartment, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. But soon after, she began to notice that her doll seemed to be moving around the room. In the following days, these occurrences seemed to persist. She began to see sticky notes scattered throughout their apartment, with phrases like "hello" and "it's broken." These notes were written on leather paper, something they didn't even have in the house. One afternoon, while alone in the apartment, Claw heard a faint rustling sound, as if someone was moving inside. She froze, straining to listen. After a moment, she began searching the rooms but found no one. However, on the bedroom floor, she saw the doll lying face down, its neck broken at an odd angle. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she glanced at her hand, horrified to see bloodied scratches. The streaks of blood ran down her palm, though she had no idea how they got there. She stared at the doll, feeling as though its lifeless eyes were mocking her. What she couldn't understand was that within 2 days, the scratches vanished as if they had never existed. That night, Clara lay in bed, nervous. She tried to close her eyes, but a faint whisper echoed throughout the room, growing louder and louder until she could clearly hear the words, "It's over." Suddenly, a pressure bore down on her, and her eyes flew open to find the doll just centimeters from her face. Its eyes locked onto hers. Claw gasped for breath. She sat up, but the doll had vanished. It remained on the shelf as if it had never moved. Days passed, and Claw became increasingly withdrawn, her face pale, eyes dim. The presence of the doll seemed to grow, draining her energy. In a final frenzy, Claw found a metal bin in a nearby alley and threw the doll into the fire. The fabric doll burned, and Claw looked away, believing it was all over, and went home. But when she returned, the doll, singed but seemingly unharmed, sat inexplicably in her room. She felt powerless and exhausted. She picked it up. Suddenly, she collapsed to the floor, a strange sensation washing over Claw, as if her soul was being pulled from her body, drained by the doll. The next morning, an old woman stood in an alley. In her hands, she tightly clutched the tilted doll. People passed by, avoiding looking, instinctively feeling uneasy before her presence. Then there was a girl whose expression was more curious than scared. Her eyes stared at the doll, a curious excitement flashing in her gaze. She walked over and held out the doll. "You seem to like it, don't you?" She held out her hand, almost reaching for it before she pushed it away like she always did. She was excited to have it. Letting go, she watched contentedly as her new victim clutched the doll. Seemingly unaware of the curse, she was welcoming. As the young girl turned away, the old woman's eyes followed her. That's right. She was born to do this. Vengeance of the soul. It was Saturday night, and Hannah was still at her university library, finishing a project due next week. Her friend had ditched her again, leaving her to finish it all on her own. She checked the clock and saw it was nearly 10 p.m., so she closed her textbooks and returned them to the shelf. Hannah went back to the table and put her books in her bag, and at that moment, she heard a noise. She looked around and thought she saw a man staring at her, but when she blinked, he was gone. Hannah left and headed home. She knew she shouldn't wander alone in a new city. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned around, seeing a figure in a dark hoodie disappearing into an alleyway. She stopped, feeling a surge of fear. Was someone following her? She hurried on, relieved that her apartment was nearby. Hannah got into her building safely. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. Just as the doors were closing, someone reached in to stop them. She held her breath as the doors opened, and a tall, fairly handsome man stepped into the elevator, his dark eyes looking at her with a warm expression. He started a friendly conversation, complimenting her outfit. She blushed, feeling a bit nervous. The elevator stopped on the 13th floor, and he stepped out, looking back at her and saying, "See you around." But as the doors started to close, Hannah saw him reach into his coat and pull out a shiny knife. Realizing the danger, she pulled out her phone as the elevator reached her floor. But just as she dialed the last digit for the police, the doors opened again. She screamed as she saw the man standing at the door, with nowhere left to run. He plunged the knife into her chest, her sweater soaking with blood. Pain spread across her chest as everything faded to black. The next morning, neighbors found Hannah dead in the elevator. Residents raised concerns about safety measures. Security cameras were installed, and more importantly, an emergency stop button was added to the elevator. Months passed, and the elevator killer remained uncaught. He prided himself on getting away with the perfect murder and wondered if he could pull it off again in the same building. He chose another Saturday night and saw a woman waiting to enter the elevator. He stood behind her, ensuring the guard was still distracted by his game on his phone. He pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he noticed the camera. The doors opened, and the woman stepped inside. Just like before, she pressed 14, and he said he lived on the 13th floor as he pressed the button. But the woman didn't respond. She seemed strange, her head bowed, her hair covering most of her face. She wore a white dress and was barefoot, which he found odd, but her appearance didn't concern him. He kept a knife in his pocket, eager to use it. The 13th floor arrived, and he began to step out. He was ready to repeat what he'd done before, but as he turned back, he realized she was no longer in the elevator. Confusion crossed his face. He was certain she'd been there, but now the elevator was empty. He went in to check. The elevator door suddenly closed, and the overhead lights crunched and dimmed. He heard a hiss. The man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a chill ran down his spine. The guy looked up, and his eyes widened. The woman was crawling on the ceiling, her hair growing long and slithering like a snake. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her smiling mouth revealed many sharp teeth. He noticed a blood stain on her sweater and realized she was Hannah, the woman he had murdered. Hannah's spirit reached out, grabbing his neck, savoring his terror. Then Hannah pulled him into her bloody mouth, her razor-sharp teeth waiting for him. His screams echoed within the metallic confines of the elevator, but no one heard. The killer became nothing more than a memory, consumed by the very spirit he had created. The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C., Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard. All young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment. Uber drivers, weird night. I had been driving Uber for about a year and had never really encountered any trouble, except for once when a drunk man tried to punch out my backseat window. But the only reason I quit this job has to do with something I had never encountered, and to this day, I still remember it vividly. Around midnight, I received a request to pick up someone named Pamela at an address that seemed a bit off the usual route. I drove to the address. The area was deserted, and there were no signs of anyone being around. Suddenly, the back door opened, and I jumped in surprise. Turning around, I saw an elderly woman, probably in her 80s. At this late hour, it was a bit odd, but I had seen older passengers before, though not very often. She silently struggled to get into the back seat, and I noticed her hollow, empty eyes, as if she had just woken up from a coma and couldn't make sense of what was happening around her. "How's your night, Pamela?" I asked cheerfully and friendly, but she didn't respond. A beep from my phone. A destination popped up. It was quite nearby, but I had never heard of it before, so I felt a little uneasy. I drove, trying to push that strange feeling out of my mind. The city blurred by in a haze, but then a voice, low and raspy, finally spoke. "Why aren't you taking me to that address?" she said to me. I told her I was taking her there, and it was still quite a distance. I replied, trying to stay polite. But the uneasy feeling, something wasn't right, kept growing. Then she started yelling at me, demanding I stop the car. It felt a bit rude, but what I needed to do now was stay polite. I wanted her out of my car, so I happily complied and stopped. I complied, stopping the car at a quiet corner just a few blocks away. I tilted my head to glance over my shoulder to wish her good luck, as it was part of my daily routine. But when I turned back, Pamela was right in front of my face, just millimeters away, hovering between the two front seats. I froze. Her eyes were white, sunken deep into her face. Her mouth was wide open, gasping for air, as if struggling and laboring to breathe. I stammered, "Pamela, are you okay?" Then her hand touched my shoulder. It was cold as ice, seeping into my skin and bones. Her pupils rolled back into her head, leaving her eyes completely white. My mind couldn't comprehend anything, and I began to fear for my own life. Before I could say anything, she leaned close to my ear and whispered in a chilling voice, "Go to the stairs tonight." I looked at her, confused. Pamela didn't say anything else, then climbed out of the car. I watched her shuffle toward a dilapidated building and disappear inside. I whispered to myself, not knowing what the hell had just happened. That night, I turned off the app and drove back to my apartment. When I arrived at the building, I sat in my car for about 10 to 15 minutes, trying to make sense of the woman's words. Eventually, I calmed down and went inside the apartment. I had just moved into this place because the rent was cheap, and it was an old building. People always complained about the maintenance and facilities. It really needed repairs, but the landlord never cared. I lived on the 6th floor. I went to the elevator and pressed the button, watching the numbers slowly go down. There was no one else in the lobby, but I couldn't shake the chill running down my spine. The numbers on the screen flickered. Suddenly, I heard a hoarse whisper, cold and close to my ear, "Close it." I jumped, looking around, but there was no one there. Pamela, is she following me? Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I sprinted toward the stairs, almost crawling on all fours as I climbed. The darkness below seemed to be chasing me. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and sat on the floor. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something had collapsed to the ground, and the fire alarm went off, with people screaming. I opened the door and saw other tenants looking down the hallway, talking in panic. The elevator, it malfunctioned and crashed. The landlord was handcuffed and led away, charged with endangering tenants by neglecting maintenance. Other residents were shouting at him, angry at his irresponsibility. I stood still in disbelief that I was alive. As the police took the landlord away, I overheard two tenants talking, saying they remembered him once saying he had fixed it, but Mrs. Miller still died, crushed. They couldn't even imagine how terrified she must have felt when the elevator fell. "Who are you talking about?" I asked. One person answered, "That's Pamela Miller, the woman who lived in your apartment before you. She died in that very elevator, but somehow, the landlord got away with it. I still visit her grave sometimes. God bless her." My head spun as I tried to understand. I had just driven a woman named Pamela. I realized that the woman I had met, killer in the rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch, watching TV, and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there? Just standing near my house in the pouring rain. I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and it called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside, they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet, but they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared, my hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my My steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. The girl in the red dress. The house we moved into after my father's death wasn't anything special, just another old, quiet mansion in the suburbs, far removed from our old life. It had been abandoned for a while, and it was clear why the rent was suspiciously cheap. Overgrown grass and neglected old furniture gave it a forgotten feel. But to my mother, it was home. I was 20 years old, and I dealt with my grief in my own way. Not long after we moved in, I began noticing small things slowly emerging in the house. But the sounds of whispers, creaking noises made me uneasy and anxious living there. It started with scratching, soft, persistent, on the other side of my bathroom door. At first, I ignored it, hoping it was just my imagination. But night after night, the sound continued. Then came the knocking, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the window. It always came around midnight, but no one could possibly be there. We kept the gate locked, and no one could enter the yard. Yet the knocking continued. I told my mother. She dismissed it, saying, "It's just an old house." But I knew the house wasn't just old, it was holding on to something. One night, I invited my friend Joe to stay over. We were sitting in my room talking about school when we heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was well past midnight. Everyone should have been asleep. Out of curiosity, we pressed our ears against the door. A conversation was happening just outside, but we couldn't make out a single word. We tiptoed into the hallway, but the kitchen was empty, dark, cold. We checked the entire house, nothing. Everyone was asleep. The voices were gone, leaving only a chilling silence. A few weeks later, my brother decided to test his luck. He and his friends thought it would be fun to play with a Ouija board in my room while I was away. They thought it was just a silly, superstitious game. At first, nothing happened. They laughed awkwardly, asking questions but receiving no response. Then one of them froze. His face turned pale, his body stiff like a statue. Without a word, he bolted from the room, his friends close behind, terror in their eyes. Once outside, the guy finally spoke. He had seen her, a girl, standing at the bathroom door, wearing a red dress, her hand on the knob, staring at them. He said she couldn't have been older than 13, and her eyes were filled with something he couldn't describe. Fear, anger, curiosity. When my brother told me this, I thought he was just trying to scare me. Of course, I didn't believe him. Why would I? I had never seen her. But the story haunted me, lodged deep in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Later, I had a birthday party at a friend's house. Jordan, a friend of mine, got drunk, so I took him to my room and told him to stay there until he sobered up. He collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Later, I went to check on him. The room was pitch black, with only a faint light coming from the bathroom. Jordan wasn't in bed. He was sitting at the bathroom door, one leg in, one leg out, talking to no one. I tapped his shoulder. He jumped, then looked at me, confused. He glanced back at the bathroom, then at me again. He mumbled, "I thought I was talking to you, but I just laughed it off, thinking he was too drunk." The next day, he explained, I was teasing him, but he was dead serious. In his drunken state, he had seen a girl in the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress, standing in the middle of the bathroom, asking why he was there. And when I walked in, she disappeared. It didn't stop there. The hauntings, the knocking, the voices continued. My fear grew as one by one. People close to me began talking about an entity that I had never seen in this house. I left my room and went to talk to my mother. While we were on vacation, my aunt and uncle stayed at the house. When we returned, they were sleeping on the living room floor, terror etched across their faces. They said the shower in my room kept turning on by itself, and the radio too, making it impossible for them to stay inside. My mother had no choice but to confront the landlady, who initially denied everything. But the truth came out. The landlady's mother had lived in this house as a teenager with her twin sister, who had ended her life in the bathroom wearing a red dress. It was all true. The red dress, the girl, the spirit trapped within the walls of our home. I didn't know how I was going to convince my mother to leave, but since we were struggling financially, it was piling up. So I had no choice but to stay in the house a little longer. The girl in the red dress. The days that followed were tense, filled with a thick sense of unease that blanketed the house. My mother decided we should move out and find a new place to live. However, things weren't settled yet, and we faced difficulties, so we had to stay in the house a little longer to figure things out. That was our last night in the house. I couldn't sleep. The woman in the red dress kept lingering, haunting my mind. I lay in bed, wrestling with these thoughts until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see the house one last time. I got out of bed and walked through the dark hallway. I headed to the bathroom, where it all began. As I reached the bathroom, a chill filled the air, heavy with tension. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling something preventing me from turning on the light. I stepped inside, the cold tiles pressing against my feet, and then I felt another presence in the room. Fear gripped me tightly. Her presence was so strong, I could feel her breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. As I stood in the darkness of the bathroom, a cold hand rested on my shoulder, and a flood of images of the girl in the red dress filled my mind. It was as if she was showing me her story. Buried for decades, The girl, now known to me as Maria, had lived in this house long ago. She was intelligent and talented, but her life was full of suffering because her twin sister was always more favored for her beauty. Everything about Maria seemed overshadowed by her sister. As the years passed, she felt trapped in her own home, living in her sister's shadow, who seemed to have everything Maria longed for. The breaking point came when her sister fell in love with a man. They planned to marry, with their parents' blessing. But Maria, who had quietly loved the same man, was devastated. Even her own chance at happiness was taken from her. Unable to bear the pain, Maria spent much of her time in the small bathroom. It became her sanctuary, the only place where she could escape the suffocating presence of her sister, and the life she felt was never meant for her. One night, overwhelmed by sorrow and loneliness, she made a tragic decision. She thought that leaving this world would make things better, and she ended her life in that very bathroom. Her sister, consumed by guilt, left the house in grief, but Maria's spirit remained bound to the house, trapped in the place where she had taken her own life. As the images faded, I understood the profound despair of Maria. Her spirit had lingered all these years, waiting for someone to recognize her pain. But now, as I stood there in the bathroom, I felt a strange connection with her. The sorrow that had once filled the room was replaced with an intense urge to help her find peace. I whispered, trembling, calling Maria's name. I told her, "I understand what you've been through. You don't deserve to be so alone. I'll leave, and you don't need to stay here anymore. It's time to let go and find peace." In that moment, the cold hand on my shoulder lifted. The oppressive air slowly began to ease. For the first time since we moved in, it felt as if the house itself had released its hold on her after all this time. That night, I slept in my bed without fear, no knocking, scratching, or voices. Everything had disappeared. Perhaps she had finally left, freeing herself from the chains she had once forged. The next morning, as we packed the last of our belongings into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the old, stately mansion. As we drove away, I felt that Maria had found the peace she longed for. The house was just a house now, no longer haunted by the sorrow of the past. And though I know I will never return, I will always remember Maria, the poor girl in the red dress, who finally found the freedom she had been denied in life. Echoes from the haunted shop. It all began as a challenge. Every town has one, a haunted location that no one dares to enter after dark. For their city, it was an old fast food restaurant that had closed down years ago after a string of mysterious deaths. Now, it stood there, decaying at the corner of the street. For years, stories surrounded the place. Customers disappeared. Strange noises echoed at night, and lights flickered inside despite no power. Some even claimed the place was cursed. The building loomed before them, weeds sprouting through cracks in the sidewalk, and an old, rusty delivery truck sat in a distant corner. The neon sign had long since died, but somehow, even in its decay, it emitted an eerie glow under the moonlight. They approached the door, and James pushed it open without hesitation. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. A foul odor immediately assaulted their noses, a rotten mixture of mold and something much worse, something decaying. But as she stepped inside, Sarah felt a chill seep into her bones. Her eyes darted around, wide with anticipation. Inside, the scene was worse than expected. It looked frozen in time, as if everyone had left one day and never returned. Dust covered the wrapping counter and old trays lay scattered on the floor. Then, a flickering light appeared at the back, something that shouldn't have been on. As there was no power here, they moved toward the kitchen, where most of the rumors originated. They said a corpse had been found here. As they approached the kitchen door, the overhead light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. James gave a nervous smile. The kitchen was a mess. Rusty appliances were caked with grease. The tiled floor was cracked, and dark stains splattered the walls. They began to hear whispering growing louder, coming from the old cold storage room at the back of the kitchen. Sarah stepped closer and peered inside. Something caught her attention, a reflection. At the back of the cold storage room, behind the shelves, was a mirror. The strange thing was they had never seen a mirror inside a cold storage before. And in the reflection were the two of them. But there was another dark shadow standing right behind Sarah and James. She turned around abruptly, but the room was empty. But in the mirror, they could both see her. A woman. She stood just a few feet away, her sunken eyes and skeletal face staring at them hungrily. In fear, they turned to leave, but the cold storage door slammed shut with a deafening noise. Darkness seemed to engulf them. She didn't dare look back, feeling a chilling presence as if she were right there behind her. Sarah fumbled for her phone, desperately seeking light, and when she turned on the flashlight, everything only got worse. In the beam of light, Sarah saw her face. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It was pale, eyes rolled back, emaciated, and her skin seemed to crack. Her bony fingers brushed against Sarah's skin. And then, suddenly, as quickly as it had started, she vanished. Before she could regain her composure, in the corner of the room, hidden among boxes and discarded trays, something caught Sarah's eye. She stopped, pointing with a trembling finger. It was a woman lying on the floor, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It was still decaying. She thought it couldn't be simple. Perhaps it was a murder. There was no time to think anymore. They hurriedly left the place. Sarah trembled. In a panic, she pulled out her phone to call 911. A while later, they arrived to cordon off and investigate the abandoned place. Then they heard an announcement from a detective. The woman they found matched the missing person they were searching for. Her family had reported her missing just 2 days prior. A chill ran down their spines as they heard his words. Realizing they had just encountered the victim of an unsolved case made the atmosphere feel heavy. Returning home, even now in the silence of the room, they sometimes heard whispers. They thought perhaps this wasn't a place to explore. There's always a reason why places like this have rumors, and they often stem from real dangers. The darkness from the Myers house. I used to work for DoorDash a few years ago, wandering through the maze of New York City at midnight to earn a few extra bucks. Tonight was no different, but it turned out to be my last delivery, a job that haunted me long after I left. GPS led me to an unfamiliar part of the city, dark and alien. My destination was an old, rundown fast food joint I'd never seen before. A man came out of the kitchen holding a package. It was red, like rotting meat, and I seriously doubted the hygiene and quality of their food. Handing me the package, the man said it was to be delivered to a place called the Myers house. The old man looked at me with hollow eyes and said to deliver it just before midnight, not to knock, just to leave it at the door. Confused, I asked if I should notify the customer. The man's face darkened. "You don't want to disturb Mrs. Myers. Trust me, it's for your own good and safety." His words lingered as I left. Something felt very wrong about this delivery, and I couldn't help but dwell on the strangeness of it all. In the drizzling rain, GPS led me down an abandoned road, miles away from any familiar part of the city. Soon, a shape emerged in the mist, the Myers house. The building loomed before me, old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows. I checked the address again. It matched. A dim light flickered on the porch, but there was no doorbell. I hesitated, then knocked on the heavy old door. The sound echoed in the silence, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a face. A pale woman appeared in the gap. She whispered, "Didn't he tell you not to knock?" I stammered an apology, then made an excuse. It's so dark, and I didn't want to leave the food outside." She gave a strange smile, her bony fingers brushing against mine as she took the package. They were icy cold, the chill seeping into my bones. At that moment, a loud clap of thunder boomed outside, and rain began pouring down. I groaned at the thought of heading back out into the storm. She looked at me. "You can wait here. Perhaps a cup of tea while you warm yourself?" Exhausted and soaked, it being my last shift, I figured it wouldn't hurt. So, I stepped inside. I followed her inside, surprised by the stark contrast to the exterior. A large stone fireplace cast a warm glow across the luxurious living room. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor and offered me tea. I sat down, feeling a bit uneasy. She began offering me dessert, but I declined. Then her expression shifted. Eleanor's smile grew dark and menacing. Suddenly, something gleamed, a butcher knife in her hand. I froze, realizing the hunger burning in Eleanor's eyes. Panic overtook me. My head spun as I tried to stand, but my legs felt leaden, my movements sluggish. I could barely lift my arms. I forced myself to stand, reaching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a brass candlestick. As Eleanor lunged, staggering, I swung with all the strength I had left. The candlestick connected with a sickening crack, sending her sprawling to the floor. Her bony fingers clawed at the carpet, dragging her broken body toward me, the hunger in her eyes burning brighter. Taking advantage of the brief respite, I staggered toward the front door, fumbling for the handle. With desperate strength, I yanked the door open. I didn't look back as I ran into the storm. I kept running until I saw and flagged down a passing car, collapsing onto the wet sidewalk. The last thing I saw was a stranger's worried face as I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital room and was told I had been drugged with sedatives. Even more shocking was that the restaurant where I had picked up Eleanor's order had vanished. It didn't exist on GPS. I can't help but think there are still hidden restaurants scattered across the city, secretly catering to the midnight cravings of cannibals I'll never understand. The town's haunted mystery. It was during one of our arguments, moving from yelling to an uncomfortable silence. Kira suggested, almost hesitantly, maybe we just need to leave. Start somewhere new. She stared at the wall, her voice trembling. I thought differently. I didn't believe a change of scenery would solve anything, but despair hung thick in the air between us. We'd gone through endless nonsense for months, arguing over small things like dishes left in the sink or unwashed clothes, which then escalated into intense fights. Our little daughter, Lily, would stand in the corner, clutching her toy, her eyes sad as if she understood more than we realized. The arguments became unbearable, and I felt as though our family was crumbling day by day. The drive to our new town was filled with silence. The sun began to set, casting an orange glow on the horizon as we traded one skyline for endless fields. I cracked the window, breathing in fresh air, feeling a weight lift off my chest. Kira smiled at me, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Eventually, we drove up to our new house. It was a small, cozy old building nestled among others on the street. As we unpacked, I felt a flicker of hope. It was the first time I saw her. Margaret, an elderly woman in a sweater and long skirt, stood on the sidewalk. She waved as she saw us, holding a plate of cookies to welcome us to the neighborhood. As we exchanged pleasantries, I noticed a girl standing behind Margaret, around Lily's age but with a troubling paleness. Then she complimented my daughter. I replied, trying to smile politely, but something about Margaret felt strange. Her enthusiasm was odd. Suddenly, she turned serious, mentioning a certain well. She began to tell me about a wishing well in town, urging me to bring Lily there, assuring me she would love it. A wishing well. I found it rather strange, like a local legend from where I lived. She said it would bring luck to anyone who made a wish and tossed in a coin, a tradition spanning generations. The conversation made me uncomfortable. Kira shrugged, but I felt a chill as I watched Margaret leave, the girl following her like a shadow. In the days that followed, the town felt like a breath of fresh air. The change in atmosphere worked wonders for our family. Kira and I argued less, and Lily seemed to thrive in the open space of our new home. The townsfolk were friendly and laid back. Yet, the well kept coming up in conversation. I overheard a cashier mention it, saying, "The well changed my life." At work, my coworkers talked about it as if it were some sort of miracle. Finally, one night, I mentioned it to Kira about everyone's obsession with this well. She just thought it was probably one of their local traditions. But the unease grew heavier. The atmosphere at work changed. My hours were cut, and coworkers became distant. It felt like something was pressing down on us, suffocating us. Kira's mood turned dark, and we argued over trivial things again. One night, I was wandering through the forest. I stumbled upon the well. It stood ominously in a clearing, its stone walls oddly slick. I could feel the weight of the town's tradition pulling me back. What if I made a wish? Desperation clawed within me. I approached the well, heart pounding. I had nothing left to lose. I pulled a quarter from my pocket, thinking of my family, of needing things to get better. I tossed the coin in, wishing for things to improve. A silence fell over me as I turned to leave. At that moment, Margaret appeared, her smile wide and unsettling. "You made a wish, didn't you?" I nodded, feeling a mix of hope and dread rising within me. She simply said, "It will come true," and then smiled, walking away. The next morning, I woke up to the familiar warmth in bed. Kira lay beside me, her face peaceful. I glanced around, feeling a weight lift from my chest. I had a strange feeling of hope, as though everything was falling back into place. Breakfast was a cheerful event, laughter filling the room. It felt like the burdens of the past had been lifted. We were happy, almost too happy. But a small part of me felt something wasn't quite right. And everything from that day began that night. While lying in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling of insecurity. Something is wrong. Lily's scream broke the silence, and I rushed to my child's room. Lily trembled, her eyes wide open in fear as she cried and pointed to me that there was a monster in the window. I hurried to the window, pulled back the curtains, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street and the trees. What is happening? I whispered to myself, feeling panic rise within me. I turned back to Lily, who was still staring at the window, pale and terrified. I stood frozen, trying to comfort her in my arms, though the unease gnawed at me. I stayed up late that night, with Lily between Kira and me. Kira, exhausted from sleepless nights, drifted off, leaving me on high alert. The following days were a chaotic mix of anxiety and paranoia. Lily's nightmares became a nightly occurrence, and each time, I found myself jolted awake by her screams. I tried to distract myself with errands around town, but whispers seemed to follow me everywhere I went. The locals had hollow smiles, with something in their eyes I couldn't quite identify. It felt like the whole town was watching me. "Everything will be fine," a cheerful cashier said as I bought groceries, but her smile felt like a mask hiding something sinister. "Just make a wish by the well. I never wanted this nightmare. I never wanted my family involved in any twisted game. One evening, after another night of Lily's screams, I found myself back at the well, drawn by some force I couldn't understand. The air was tense as I approached, Margaret's words echoing in my mind. As I stood there, I noticed the well's surface glistening under the moonlight, almost inviting me. I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. The chill of the night air made me shiver. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched washed over me once again. I felt a presence lurking in the darkness, and panic took over. I ran home, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. Kira was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. I quickly ran to Lily's room to check on her and saw she was fast asleep. But when I looked closer, I noticed a thin layer of sweat on her forehead. Something wasn't right. I went back to Kira, pacing the floor, my mind spinning. We need to do something. This can't keep happening. Kira's gaze was distant, lost in thought. She said to me, "Maybe we should leave. We could pack up and go somewhere else." "No," I snapped stubbornly, feeling the weight of despair. "We can't keep running. We need to find a way to fix this." That night, I decided to confront Margaret. I needed to know the truth. With my heart racing, I left the house and headed to hers. As I approached, the atmosphere changed. I knocked on the door, fear rising within me. She greeted me with a smile that seemed friendly, but it didn't feel genuine at all. I desperately told her I needed to know what was happening. Her expression turned serious, her eyes narrowing. "You know, wishes come with consequences," she said softly. Leaning closer, "You wished for things to be better. But what if there's a cost?" I felt myself unraveling as she kept talking about what I had lost. She tilted her head, that predatory smile returning. "It's not always clear. Sometimes you get what you wish for by sacrificing something else, something precious." I stumbled back, wondering if I had traded my daughter's happiness for a hollow life. When I returned home, I found Lily in her room, but she wasn't the girl I once knew. Laughter seemed to have been replaced by an eerie silence. She looked at me with hollow eyes, like an empty shell. Regret weighed heavily on me. I had wanted to fix everything, but I had only made it worse, foolishly believing in something dark and twisted. I returned to the well, desperate to undo my wish. I knelt by the edge, staring into the darkness. I want my daughter back. I didn't want this to happen, but the well remained silent. Days passed, and our home became like a prison as Lily worsened, her strange behaviors leaving me helpless and heartbroken, unsure of what to do. Every time I went outside, those around me kept smiling, but their eyes hid a secret, a dark truth I could never grasp. They too had made their wishes, and I was just another pawn in their game. In the end, I made a decision. I would play the game, just like Margaret had. I would find another family and make them wish, too, to replace my daughter. As I walked through the town, I spotted a family moving in down the street, a young couple with a little girl who looked just like Lily. I approached them, a smile spreading across my face. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, hiding the darkness within. And no, with a new cast in the pipeline. Maybe the darkness had clouded my vision and taken over. I didn't know when this would end or if there was any escape. The girl looked up, her eyes bright and full of life, unaware of the fate that awaited her. Perhaps I had to be the villain, to save my daughter, my family. Home alone with a strange stalker. The house sat quietly in the suburban neighborhood, dark and isolated. The rain pattered against the windows, with occasional flashes of lightning hinting at an approaching storm, making everything feel more ominous than usual. Eva was watching a horror movie in the living room. Yet, every now and then, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, a part of her always feeling like something might be lurking behind her. After the movie ended, she went about her nightly routine, brushing her teeth, turning off the lights, and heading to bed. However, her peaceful sleep was interrupted around 1 a.m. when she heard a voice downstairs calling her name. At first, she wasn't sure what was happening. The voice sounded oddly like her sister's, but Eva couldn't be certain, especially since her sister rarely came home. She got out of bed and walked down the hallway. The house was pitch black, the thick silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps. She entered the kitchen. The lights flickered, and Eva saw something. A knife lying on the kitchen floor, one she distinctly remembered cleaning and putting away earlier. She looked around, but no one was there. A few days later, she still hadn't shaken off the feeling. Eva tried to relax by watching TV, and at some point, she fell asleep there. While asleep, she heard a faint rustling noise. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen. A light flickered near the refrigerator. She cautiously approached. The scene sent chills down her spine.
Lily?
She softly called, but there was no response. She moved closer. Her sister appeared to be sitting with her back to the refrigerator, eating something in an almost frantic manner. Something about the way she was eating felt off. She wasn't sure it was really her sister. Exhausted, Eva chuckled to herself, thinking perhaps her sister was just really hungry, trying to steady her trembling hands. She dismissed the thought, assuming it was her sister, and went back to her room, too tired to care. The next morning, before heading to school, Eva saw her sister. Eva asked her about the strange encounter.
Were you okay last night, Lily? Why were you home so late?
Lily looked surprised and confused, unsure of what Eva was talking about. She told Eva that she had worked the night shift and hadn't come home last night. Lily assumed Eva must have been sleepwalking. Eva froze. The woman she saw eating frantically in the kitchen wasn't her sister. But then, who was it? As usual, Eva finished dinner and began tidying up in the kitchen. Suddenly, the lights went out without warning. She stumbled in the darkness, trying to locate the light switch. As her hand reached out for the switch, she felt an icy presence standing behind her. A chill ran down her spine as she glimpsed a reflection in the refrigerator door. It was a figure resembling her sister, grinning unnaturally wide. She thought it must be a hallucination, a trick of her mind. That night, Eva struggled to sleep, tossing and turning in bed. Eventually, she dozed off, but was abruptly awakened by the sensation of the bed shifting beside her. Her eyes flew open in shock. She turned and froze. It wasn't a woman, but a man with a beard sitting on her bed. His lifeless eyes bore into hers as he spoke in a calm, haunting voice.
Eva, my sister.
Eva screamed and bolted from the bed. The man disguised as her sister chased after her, laughing slyly. She ran, desperate to escape. At the door, she fumbled with the handle in panic. Just as she managed to open it, he, still in his disguise, grabbed her arm and laughed triumphantly. Eva struggled, grabbing a lampstand from a nearby shelf and smashing it against his face. She fought her way free and sprinted to a neighbor's house for help. The neighbor helped her call the police, but when they arrived to take him away, he was sitting curled up in fear, then laughing inexplicably in Eva's room. The man, once in custody, confessed that he had been stalking her for a long time, hiding in the shadows. His trauma stemmed from a history of abuse. He had a compulsion to impersonate the people he encountered, believing he was becoming those he wanted to harm, including pretending to be Eva's sister. Eva and her sister finally found peace after the man was arrested, though the experience left emotional scars they could never forget. They comforted each other, knowing the nightmare was finally over. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then, but something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day.
"Mom, where are you? I'm cold."
That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard,
Mom, where are you?
I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered,
Mom, where is she?
I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate.
Where is my mom? I want to see her.
As if he didn't believe the words I was saying. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything. His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper.
Thank you.
I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. The obsession with the house by the quarry. Tom's family moved to an old house near a quarry in Minnesota. He had a new job in a small town, and his family would stay there for a few weeks. Boxes were scattered across the hardwood floor. Emily sat by the fireplace, arranging her stuffed animal collection. Evi, his wife, sat in a chair, sipping tea and watching their daughter. Meanwhile, Tom was organizing tools in the corner of the room. But sometimes, the silence in the house was too heavy. The creaking of the wooden floor beneath their feet sounded louder than it should. The house fell silent, Save for the faint howling wind outside, Tom lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His gaze turned toward the window. For a moment, Tom saw her, a shadowy figure of a woman with milky white eyes staring at him through the glass. Tom sat up in alarm. When he looked back, she was gone. Then Emily screamed. They rushed to her room. She was sitting on her bed, her tiny body trembling, her wide eyes filled with tears. She pointed under the bed and said,
"She's under the bed? The woman with the white eyes. She wants me to hide under the bed."
Tom bent down and looked under the bed, but saw nothing. They reassured Emily that it was just a nightmare, but something about her description made them uneasy. To ease her fear, the next day, they installed a small hidden camera in her room. What they discovered that night sent chills down their spines. On the screen, they watched her fitful sleep together. Hours passed without incident, until, suddenly, the blanket began sliding off her, as if pulled by invisible hands. The little girl's small body shifted toward the edge of the bed, slowly as if being dragged. Then suddenly, she was yanked down violently. She fell off the bed and was pulled under it, disappearing from their view. They rushed to her and found her curled up on the floor, crying in fear. Tom opened the live feed on his phone. On the screen, a faint silhouette of a girl was hiding under the bed. She was crawling, hiding under Emily's bed. Her hollow, black eyes stared directly at the camera. Emily's fear was unrelenting. She clung to her parents and refused to be alone. They decided to stay in the living room that night. As they sat on the sofa, the lights began to flicker. Then a cold hand brushed against Evi's cheek. She screamed in terror, but when she turned around, nothing was there. Emily screamed as one of her toys rolled into the room and stopped at her feet. Tom realized everything was spiraling out of control. He needed to grab the car keys from the bedside table. When he reached the bedroom, in the mirror, he saw her standing there, grinning maliciously. Tom grabbed the keys and ran back to the living room. They rushed to the front door, but it slammed shut as they reached it. The back door was their only chance. As they ran through the kitchen, glass shattered all around them. Everything seemed to be trying to stop them from leaving. With a desperate kick, the door burst open. As they got outside, Emily pointed toward the house. In the upstairs window, she, the figure with sunken eyes, was watching them leave. They got to the car and quickly drove away. They sat in silence, knowing they would never return to that house. The house on the edge of the quarry remains, holding its secrets. For the family, it is a memory they will never escape. The mystery behind a portrait. Moving in with Eric was supposed to be the start of something beautiful, but the moment she crossed the threshold, an unsettling chill enveloped her. Jamie's gaze settled on a large painting prominently displayed in the living room. It was a portrait of a beautiful woman with long, dark hair and piercing eyes. From the moment she saw it, she felt deeply uneasy. The woman's eyes seemed strangely alive. Jamie shivered, feeling the weight of those eyes on her. She thought it was watching her. She glanced at Eric, who was arranging painting supplies nearby.
It's just a painting, Jamie.
He reassured her with a soft laugh, but something inside her didn't agree. As Jamie lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of the woman's piercing gaze. It felt as though the woman in the painting wanted to tell her something. Then one night, she had a nightmare, the woman stepping out of the painting. A cold hand gripped her arm, and the woman in the painting whispered one chilling word.
Run.
Jamie jolted awake in panic. She could still feel her presence in the room, her eyes burning into Jamie. After another sleepless night, she asked Eric to move the painting out of their shared space, and reluctantly he agreed. He moved it to his office, but the unease remained, growing with each passing day. Instead of feeling relieved, things only got worse. He spent hours in his office with the painting, muttering to himself in soft, frantic whispers. When he appeared, his arms were scratched and bruised, as if he had fought with something or someone. Jamie's suspicion grew. One night, after Eric had fallen asleep, Jamie gathered her courage and snuck into his office, determined to uncover what was going on. As Jamie got closer to the painting on the wall, the woman's eyes now looked fiercer than ever. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to take a photo with her phone. Jamie began researching the image. Her heart sank as she found an old article. The woman in the painting was real, a young woman named Anna who had disappeared years ago. The last person seen with her alive was her boyfriend, who also vanished without a trace. She looked closer at the image of Anna. There was an eerie coincidence: her earrings. They were identical to the pair Eric had given her on their 1-month anniversary. With fear rising, Jamie's eyes darted around the room, searching for more clues. She noticed a white cloth over an easel, as if Eric was preparing to start a new painting. But what caught her attention was a knife lying next to his paintbrushes. Suddenly, Jamie felt a chill run down her spine. She turned back to the painting, and this time, Anna's expression had changed. Her mouth twisted and moved, forming the exact word Jamie had heard in her nightmare.
Run.
Jamie turned around, panic engulfing her. Eric was standing in the doorway, his face darkened with anger. He began asking her what she was doing there. Jamie backed away, but he continued advancing, gripping the knife tightly and saying that she knew too much. As he raised the knife, Jamie bolted, running down the hallway as fast as she could. She ran toward the door, fumbling with her phone to dial 911. But Eric was faster. He grabbed her by the neck just as she reached the front door, pulling her back with terrifying strength. Just when she thought it was all over, she heard sirens blaring outside. The police burst in. They quickly subdued Eric, pinning him to the ground as he thrashed and screamed in rage. While searching the house, the police found ample evidence behind a hidden door in Eric's basement. Behind it was a small, dusty room filled with Anna's belongings. But the most chilling discovery was Anna's decaying body hidden in Eric's basement. Finally, her spirit was set free. Before leaving, Jamie returned to Eric's office one last time. Anna's painting still hung on the wall. Her eyes were gentle, her face no longer twisted in fear or sorrow. Instead, she looked at Jamie with gratitude. The secret of the black umbrella. Last June, I had just moved to the city to attend college. Heavy rain soaked the campus as I trudged toward the dormitory, my luggage drenched. I walked through the courtyard, and my eyes caught sight of a black umbrella lying on the ground. At that moment, I wanted to find its owner, but I couldn't see anyone around. Reluctantly, I picked it up, thinking I would try to find its owner later. So, I decided to take the umbrella to the dormitory. But when I got to the dorm, I had to rush to change out of my wet clothes and prepare for bed. In the meantime, I hung the umbrella up and almost completely forgot about its existence. Outside, the rain continued to fall. After a long day and soon feeling exhausted, I prepared to sleep. As I lay down, the thought of the umbrella crossed my mind, but I brushed it aside. I woke up at midnight, feeling cold despite being under a thick blanket. A strange chill seemed to seep through the room, and as I lay there, I noticed a shadow in the hallway outside my door. But when I got up to check, I found the hallway empty. This left me a little perplexed. Then, I looked at the black umbrella hanging by the door again and told myself that I would return it in the morning. The next morning, my roommate found me feverish, my skin damp and my body weak. The dorm manager allowed me to stay in bed and rest while my friends went to class. I lay there, dozing off intermittently, the sound of rain pattering against the window only adding to my fatigue. As I slept, I heard footsteps echoing in my room, slow and cautious, as if someone was approaching. My eyes opened wide, but I was too weak to move. I felt a figure hovering beside me, suspended by the bed. Gathering all my strength, I turned my head, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing next to me was a young man, drenched in wet clothes, water dripping onto the floor. I couldn't understand how he got in. I hadn't heard the door open. Then what was peculiar was that in his hand, he held tightly onto the handle of the black umbrella. But the scariest thing was the bloodied, pale, gaunt face, the sunken, distorted eyes of the young man glaring at me with anger. I sat up in fear. He stepped closer, lowering the umbrella and raising his hand, reaching towards me as if to corner me against the wall. I stepped back as the young man leaned closer, his voice hoarse with anger as he demanded the black umbrella back. He made me feel terrified, and I screamed. As he pushed me against the wall, his rage overwhelming, I felt myself slipping away, dizzy with fear. I accidentally hit my head against the wall behind me. The last thing I remembered was his hateful gaze. When I opened my eyes, I saw the dorm manager standing next to my bed, worry etched on her face. She asked if I was okay, saying she heard me scream. I struggled to explain what I had seen, my words tumbling out in a jumble. I was confused about how to answer her. Then she and I looked down at the floor. At that moment, I was startled to see that the black umbrella I had hung at the door was no longer there. Instead, it lay beside my bed as if it had moved on its own. A chill ran down my spine, and I told the manager about the figure I had seen, the young man holding the umbrella. The owner of this umbrella had come here to reclaim it. She didn't say anything after listening, only silently picked up the umbrella. Her demeanor surprised me. It seemed she knew something. She began to tell me the story about that umbrella. Years ago, there was a student living in my dorm, a hard-working young man from a difficult background. He worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, and despite his struggles, he was well liked by everyone. The young man's father, an unusual man with a gambling addiction, tracked him down. After stealing all the money the young man had saved for his tuition, he vanished without a word. Heartbroken and crushed, the young man's spirit became bleak. Until one day, the entire dorm suddenly erupted in chaos after a loud noise rang out from the balcony. Teachers and friends were shocked to discover that he had thrown himself from the balcony. The young man's body lay motionless in a pool of blood, and no one dared to approach to help. The manager said she was there that night. Compassionately, she stood in the rain, holding the umbrella over him until his body was taken away in an ambulance. After the incident, due to the chaos, her umbrella was lost somewhere untraceable and gradually faded into obscurity. A strong gust of wind shook the door, and both of us jumped and looked up. In the doorway, I saw a figure, a young man, soaked and pale, standing just outside. The manager seemed to recognize him immediately. Suppressing her fear, she stepped closer to the apparition, her voice trembling as she spoke soothing words about his pain and loss. Any resentment within the young man seemed to dissipate. After that, everything ended, and I no longer saw that student. My manager continued to oversee my dorm. The black umbrella remained, hanging beside her in the office as a memento of the deceased student. Nightmare neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most windows were dark. Rena was standing outside, staring up at the second floor. Her floor. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet, until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and taking out the trash usually only took a few minutes. But tonight, she felt as though someone was watching her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hallway, he was there. Arthur was standing by his door, looking as though he had been waiting for her. He always found excuses to talk and stand uncomfortably close to Rena. She lowered her head, quickly murmured a greeting, and walked toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. Goosebumps rose on Rena's skin. Something felt different tonight, making her more uneasy than before. Rena entered her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to lie in bed and watch TV. It was late, and she was tired, but she wasn't ready to sleep yet. As she walked past the broom closet, she heard a faint sound, a soft rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet door handle. She hesitated. Then she pulled the door open. Arthur was in there, inside her storage closet. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He was just there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She gasped, stumbling backward, unable to believe what she was seeing. She ran into her bedroom, slamming the door shut. But she didn't have time to lock it. The door burst open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild and unhinged. She dashed toward the bathroom, the only place left to hide. She slammed the door shut just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena's back pressed against the cold bathroom wall. Her breaths came in quick gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was the only thing separating her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks. His sickening grin etched deeply into her mind. Thankfully, she had her phone. She clutched it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, strangled by the fear gripping her. Arthur pounded on the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it couldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. She didn't know if he had left. Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience had run out. His hand hovered over the doorknob. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to escape. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gleaming knife. His fingers tightened around the handle. Nightmare neighbor. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed away, nearly pressing herself against the wall. She screamed at him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a bruising grip. Rena struggled to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it against the wall. Her phone slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor. Arthur's face was only inches from hers as he hissed threats, blaming her for always ignoring him when they crossed paths in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, squeezing tighter. His knife swiped through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain tore through her skin, leaving her injured and bleeding. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder as the police rushed toward the apartment building. The flashing lights reflected on the window, like a beacon of hope in the stifling darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her neck. Her free hand flailed, fumbling along the counter by the sink and the shelves, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it against Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered backward, momentarily dazed. Arthur stumbled, and the knife slipped from his grip, falling to the floor. Rena didn't wait. She bolted for the door, clutching her bleeding arm. She fled the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Blood streamed down his face from where the glass bottle had struck him. Enraged, he grabbed the knife from the floor and charged toward her. The police stormed the apartment complex. They knew they had to act fast. Rena reached the living room, but her legs gave out, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence closing in, the knife still in his hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight in them gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, struggling to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled.
There's nowhere left to run, girl.
Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police stormed into the apartment, cutting through the tension. Arthur stubbornly held on to her, refusing to let her go. Seizing the opportunity, Rena stomped on his foot, making him cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm, but the nightmare was over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of the car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. The Graveyard Shift. 15 years. That's how long I've been working the night shift at this cemetery, a place filled only with darkness and heavy silence. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m., during a time when the rest of the world is asleep. Over the years, I've seen a lot, mainly teenagers causing trouble, or the occasional group of drunk people, but tonight was different. The night started like any other. I arrived early, had a brief chat with a daytime worker before he left. Then, it was on to the usual routine, a quick check. My only job was to drive the golf cart around occasionally, making sure everything was in order. Nothing happened. And tonight, nothing seemed to be happening either. I drove around several times before heading back to the security room for a break, which was right inside the cemetery grounds. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take another lap. As I reached the end of the yard, the headlights of the golf cart swept across the fence, hidden in the darkness. That's when I saw him, a figure standing by the fence. At first, it was just a shadow. I drove closer. Now, I could see it was a man standing outside the fence. His features were barely visible, obscured by the shadows. He was standing still, looking towards me. I didn't want to confront him, not yet, so I decided to circle the parking lot, hoping he'd be gone when I returned. But when I came back, he was gone. A deep sense of unease began to settle in. I got out of the cart, slowly, scanning the area again to make sure he hadn't snuck in. But everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. So I continued my patrol, passing through the entire yard, which took about 15 minutes. Sometimes I would slow down just to make the time go by faster. 15 minutes later, I got back in the cart and returned to the same spot. He was there again, but this time, he was inside the cemetery, standing on the gravel path. My heart raced as I drove closer, the gravel crunching under the tires. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, unnervingly still. I got out of the golf cart and started walking toward him. He looked like a man in his 40s, his clothes dirty and old. I stopped a few meters away from him and told him he wasn't allowed in here and that he should leave soon. I spoke, but he didn't respond or even turn his head to look at me. I reached out, intending to gently tap his shoulder, but the moment my hand touched him, he spun around to face me. His eyes filled with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might attack me. But instead, he turned and started walking, heading straight for the fence. I stood frozen, watching as he effortlessly walked through the fence and vanished into the darkness on the other side. Trembling, I got back in the golf cart and drove straight to the security office. I needed to calm down, to think. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to steady myself, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then there was a loud knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing. Another knock followed, this time more forceful. Panic set in. I had nowhere to go. My mind raced as I grabbed the landline and dialed 911. I explained what was happening, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking continued, relentless, until it suddenly stopped. The next day, I sat with my manager as we reviewed the CCTV footage. The grainy black and white video played on a small screen, showing the man I had seen the night before. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered, the man I had seen in the yard walked to the door. He stood there, motionless, for almost 15 minutes before he began pounding on the door. In his hand, he held something, but the footage wasn't clear enough to tell what it was. It looked like a metal rod or pipe. He was never identified, and I haven't seen him again since that night, but the memory of that night still lingers with me. Every time I drive past the cemetery, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, hoping he never appears again. Ghosts in the warehouse. I am a warehouse worker for a small business in my city. I just do certain tasks that need to be done each night. I unload the goods that are delivered and place everything in its proper place. Most of the time, I just wear headphones and listen to music while I work because the warehouse isn't too big. It's rare for someone else to be working overnight with me. The night drags on slowly. The warehouse is eerily quiet, with the only sound being the creaking of the old building. My shift started at 10 o'clock, and there were perhaps some knocking sounds between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock a.m. I stopped, took off my headphones, and tried to listen to the sound again, but it had stopped. As I returned to work, the knocking resumed, this time louder, more persistent. I froze, facing the source of the sound, a narrow, dark aisle flanked by towering shelves. The knocking stopped when I reached the aisle, leaving only darkness. As I neared the front of the warehouse, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. Confused, I recalled that I had locked it when I arrived. I walked up and pushed the door open, finding the latch broken. I quickly locked the door again, this time jamming a nearby metal bar against it for extra security. But the gesture felt futile. Determined to finish my shift, I returned to my duties, but my focus was shattered. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights felt like a warning. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight to cut through the blackness. The beam revealed only empty aisles, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I moved through the warehouse, the flashlight caught fleeting glimpses of shadows darting out of sight, too quick to be fully seen. My fear surged as I raced towards the front door. I saw the metal bar I had wedged into the door bent and twisted. I turned to face the darkness, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light revealed a tall, indistinct figure watching me from the shadows. I started breathing rapidly. The figure moved slowly towards me, its footsteps echoing loudly in the silent warehouse. In a last desperate act, I threw the flashlight at the figure and dashed into the darkness, hoping to find another way out. My frantic sprint led me to the back door of the warehouse, but just as I was about to escape, the door slammed shut, as if someone from behind had done it. I panicked and turned around, but as I was about to run back, my flashlight suddenly flickered back on. illuminating a reflection of myself in a large mirror hidden behind some old boxes. But it wasn't me. A darker version, with a blurred face, slowly raised its hand, moving while I stood frozen. It seemed to be hypnotizing me, trying to pull me somewhere. It said, "Follow me," and then gave a terrifying smile. I stumbled, too frightened to think, and grabbed the door handle, yanking it with all my strength, then ran outside, gasping for air as the fog seemed to swallow me whole. As I ran, I heard footsteps again, echoing through the mist. I turned around, but the warehouse was almost invisible through the thick fog. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted, as I turned back to face whatever was chasing me, but there was nothing there. I pulled out my phone and called the police, trembling with fear. When they finally arrived, they thoroughly searched the warehouse, but found no trace of an intruder. If I hadn't realized the door was broken, I would have faced that strange thing directly, with no way of knowing what would have happened. Although unlikely, I can't shake the feeling that it's still chasing me. So I quit the job, hoping I'll never encounter it again. The man passed through the door. It was a quiet evening. Abby was home alone as usual. Her mother often had to work 2 jobs in one day, from morning to late at night. So Abby had to take care of herself most of the time, and she was used to it. The house was peaceful. Her mother wouldn't be home for hours, so she took care of everything herself, from cooking to locking up, getting ready for bed. Before going to bed, Abby planned to relax a bit. She sat on the couch, ready to watch TV with a tub of ice cream in her hand. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. She froze, spoon of ice cream halfway to her mouth. It was strange her friends never visited this late, and her mom always used her key. Confused, she slowly walked to the door. She wasn't exactly scared, just curious. She opened the door and saw him a man. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking on. He was bald, wore thick glasses, and had a scruffy beard with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't seem threatening, but something felt off. Abby greeted him, and the man smiled and asked, "Hello, little girl. Are your parents home?" At the time, she didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a friendly question. So Abby foolishly answered that her mom wasn't home. A smile spread across his face, but then she started to feel uneasy as his questions grew too interested. He smiled and said, "Good night. Don't get into any trouble," then walked away. Abby didn't understand what had just happened, so she closed the door. Her heart was racing, but she pushed it aside. He was just being friendly, she told herself. Abby returned to her ice cream. Her mind replayed the conversation. Something about the way he had looked at her and smiled made her feel uneasy. 10 minutes passed, and she began to feel comfortable again. The strange encounter faded from her mind. Then, there was another knock at the door. She thought it might be him again. This time, something told her to be cautious. She wasn't sure why, but before opening the door, she decided to lock the chain. When Abby opened the door, the chain caught, preventing it from opening fully. And there he was, the same man from earlier. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he pretended to be friendly again. He stammered a greeting to Abby again, and said he just wanted to make sure she was okay. To her, he no longer seemed friendly. He looked desperate, as if realizing he hadn't gotten into the house and was trying to cover it up. Abby gave a quick thank you out of fear and slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she locked it. She stood there, frozen, staring at the door. Minutes passed, and she couldn't stop thinking about the man. But every sound, Every creak of the house made her jump. She needed her mom and wished she were home. Suddenly, she heard the man's voice again, this time coming from the mail slot of the front door. He was whispering through the slot, saying he wanted to come in and had something to tell Abby. Abby froze in place. She screamed, "Leave me alone." The mail slot slammed shut, and then the pounding on the door started. He was banging hard, rattling the doorknob violently, shouting crude words demanding she open the door. She stumbled back, tears streaming down her face, silently praying he wouldn't get in. The banging grew louder, more frantic, as he tried to force the door open. For what felt like an eternity, Abby stood there, sobbing, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Perhaps the man had given up and left. She didn't move, only standing there, listening. About 30 minutes later, Abby's mom came home. The door opened, and she rushed in, finding her daughter in tears. Abby told her everything. Her mom immediately called the police about the incident, but they didn't find any trace of the man. As Abby lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about how lucky she was to have used the door chain. It was a small, almost insignificant decision, but it had saved her. Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy, and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance, but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught. They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again. Ghost in the Gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room, as usual. Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, the police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloodied child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I want to help you." To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain." The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering souls. Late shift and creepy encounter. It is now 9:30 p.m., and I am still here, stuck in the dim light of the computer screen, the only source of light in a dark, empty office. I glance at the clock, sighing in frustration. I have worked here as a software engineer for 2 years, and nights like these have become all too familiar. I hope to leave soon, but I am still waiting for one last file. I push back from my desk, rubbing my tired eyes. The building is silent, too silent. I stand up, deciding to grab a cup of coffee from the cafeteria to stay awake. As I walk through the open office space, I enjoy the quiet, a calm after the daily chaos of the workday. The sound of the coffee maker buzzing is a small comfort as I pour myself a cup. An idea sparks in my mind, and with a mischievous smile, I head to the security room. After working long hours, I have a master key card that opens every door in the building. I swipe the card and step inside, greeted by a wall of screens, each showing a different part of the building. I sit down, curious, and start scrolling through the camera feeds. It's strange to see the empty squares, the vacant hallways making the passage of time more intriguing. Then, something unusual catches my eye. The elevator doors on the ground floor open, and a woman in a green dress steps out. I have never seen her before, and I am sure she doesn't work here. I track them on the camera, watching as they hold hands walking down the hallway. I lean back in my chair, stunned. Mr. Newman, my boss who left early for a celebration, has returned here in the middle of the night with another woman. I switch to other camera feeds, waiting for them to leave, and I return to his office feed feeling something is off about their expressions. I have a bad feeling. The door opens, and the woman rushes out, clearly upset. Mr. Newman follows, trying to reassure her. After a tense exchange, they head towards the cafeteria. I quickly switch to the cafeteria camera, and sure enough, they enter, sitting at a table. Mr. Newman stands up and sneaks into the kitchen area, leaving her alone. I switch to the kitchen feed, and what I see chills my blood. He is holding a knife, his expression tense, eyes searching for something. My mind races, and before I know it, I rush to the cafeteria. I approach the woman from behind, placing a hand over her mouth before she can scream. "I'm here to help," I whisper. "You need to leave. He's going to hurt you." She looks at me, confused yet scared, and nods. We turn to leave, but Mr. Newman appears in the doorway, blocking our exit, knife firmly in hand. He sneers, asking where we think we're going. I step forward, trying to shield her. He laughs, a cruel sound echoing down the hallway mockingly, saying that if so, he'll make sure we both disappear. I feel the woman beside me tense up, his expression shifting as his eyes narrow when he lunges forward, the knife aimed directly at me. I defended, but the impact was still so brutal that the blade stabbed into my hand. The pain seemed to painfully spread throughout my body. I staggered back, gritting my teeth against the intense pain of his madness. He starts shifting his focus to her, cornering her against the wall, and he begins to wildly raise the knife in anger. Desperation drives me, and I grab a nearby chair, swinging it with the last of my strength. The heavy metal frame strikes his head, causing him to stagger back. Blood flows from the cut on his forehead as he crashes to the floor, dazed for a moment. The woman screams, but she quickly pulls out her phone, her hand shaking as she calls the police. I fell against the wall, clutching my arms, my vision blurring as I struggled to stay conscious. He hisses, wiping blood from his face, saying that what I've caused will have consequences because I've ruined all his plans. He tries to stand up, but he staggers, his breathing becoming rapid and angry. The woman steps back, her voice trembling as she speaks into the phone, reporting our location. She stares down at him, a mix of fear and anger on her face. He looks up, eyes wild, and lunges toward her, but I try to grab his ankle, pulling him down. I strain to pull painfully. I shout, my voice hoarse, "Enough! It's over. You won't get away with this." The sound of approaching sirens fills the air, their wails piercing the silence. The police are on their way. Newman's face pales as he realizes time is running out. He kicks my hand in a desperate attempt to escape. The police burst into the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They find us in the hallway, and within moments, Newman is handcuffed, his expression one of utter defeat as they lead him away. I was loaded onto a stretcher. The paramedics stabilized my arms while the woman stood next to me, her face a mixture of relief and remorse. The next morning, I sit in a room at the police station, an officer seated across the table, looking at me seriously. He recounts the details they have uncovered. Newman had been seeing the woman at the scene, promising to be with her. But when she found out he was married, she threatened to expose him. Panicked and desperate to protect himself, he planned to eliminate her, believing no one would be there to witness his crime. He brought her to the office, hoping to use the quiet space to his advantage. What he didn't anticipate was my presence, my late-night habits, and my caution leading me to the security room. The officer continues to explain that Newman's wife filed for divorce, her anger and disgust evident when she learned the truth. The woman, unaware of his marital status until that night, expresses deep remorse, shaken that she almost lost her life. I lay on the hospital bed, my hand bandaged. The events of that night replayed in my mind, each moment vivid and unsettling. I stumbled upon a dark secret, and in doing so, I saved a life, narrowly escaping death. I know that night will haunt me for a long time, a reminder of how easily darkness can hide behind familiar faces. But as I prepare to leave the hospital, I feel a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that sometimes, even in the quietest corners of life, we can find ourselves amidst the unimaginable. The threat of the gas station customer. Evie had been working the night shift at the gas station for many years. It was always quiet, slow, and uneventful. Her shifts usually started at 8 p.m. every day. The first few hours passed quickly, with a steady stream of customers coming in for gas or snacks. But after 11 p.m., the traffic slowed, and by midnight, the station became eerily quiet. She tried to keep herself busy, organizing merchandise on the shelves and cleaning, but there wasn't much to do. The silence and the ticking of the clock made the second half of her shift feel endless. Around 1 a.m., a car pulled into one of the parking spots near the entrance. At first, she didn't think much of it. Most cars came in for gas and left immediately. But this car just sat there, No one got out. She stood up straight behind the counter, waiting for anyone inside to come in. She leaned over the counter, looking through the glass door, but nothing happened. Maybe they were just resting? She shrugged and continued scrolling on her phone, distracted for about 20 minutes. When she looked up from her phone, there, standing in one of the aisles, was a man. He was just there, staring at her. She hadn't heard the doorbell, hadn't seen him walk in. How had he gotten inside without her noticing? The man quickly averted his gaze when he saw her looking. He appeared to be in his 40s wearing a dark coat and a scruffy beanie. There was something about him that made her uneasy. He moved slowly through the aisles, his eyes occasionally glancing toward her, as if assessing whether she was watching him. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated. She tried to remain calm, watching him closely, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something bad. Suddenly, he turned toward the front door and hurried outside. She dashed out the door, her heart racing. The car was still parked there, but the man walked right past it, disappearing into the darkness along the road. She went straight to the security camera to figure out how he had gotten in without her noticing. She pulled up the footage, scanning through until she found the moment he arrived. The footage showed him stepping out of the parked car, but instead of going inside immediately, he stealthily made his way around to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras there, but she knew those doors were never locked because they were broken. What chilled her the most was the timing. 15 minutes passed between the moment he went behind the building and when he appeared in the store. 15 minutes he spent lurking out of sight, waiting for something. Weeks had passed since that night, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shift felt like a test for her. One night, while she was cleaning the counters, she noticed something strange. The man entered the store, his eyes scanning as if searching for something. She watched him from the corner of her eye, and that was when she saw it. Something that seemed horrific. Then he approached her checkout, and she thought she might have guessed right. Dark stains on his sleeve, splotches that looked like blood clinging to the fabric, and he had done something vile and horrible. She wasn't sure if it was the same man, but she sensed it was him by his stature and clothing. She froze, her hands clenched, as he slowly moved down the aisle, seemingly oblivious to her stare. He quickly slipped away, melting into the shadows, and she was left in silence. She resolved to take action. The next time he appeared, she would be ready. A few nights later, he returned. She heard the faint sound of the doorbell and looked up to see him standing right inside, his face hidden in the shadows. She quietly picked up the phone, dialed the police, and kept her voice just above a whisper. She reported the suspicious man, describing his erratic behavior and the blood she had seen on his sleeve. But then, he noticed her. His eyes narrowed, and he realized what she was doing. Without warning, he charged toward her, knocking the phone from her hand. She stumbled back, grabbing anything she could use to defend herself as he backed her into a corner, his face contorted into a disturbing grin. She collided with the shelves, knocking items to the floor. She tried to grab a can from a nearby rack and threw it at him, buying herself a split second to dodge him and run toward the door. But he was quick, grabbing her arm and pulling her back, forcing her against the back of the store. I encouraged myself to survive and reassured myself that the police would arrive soon. He tightened his grip and pressed his face close to hers with a terrifying gaze. She felt panic rising, but she saw the police through the glass. One of the officers raised an eyebrow and glanced at her, then looked at the man's hand on her arm. It was a signal, a silent cue. She knew what she had to do. Gathering all her courage, she turned slightly, catching the man off guard, and bit his hand. He yelled in pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to escape. She stumbled forward, getting out of his reach. The police burst through the door, quickly advancing with their weapons drawn. He hesitated, his face contorted with anger, but he knew he was outnumbered. The officers moved in, bringing him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. He thrashed, his eyes filled with rage as they restrained him. One of the officers approached her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They said he was a dangerous man, wanted for multiple assaults and murders in the city. She blinked, the reality of his words sinking in. A murderer? The thought sent chills down her spine, and she felt the weight of the encounter heavier than ever. She nodded, grateful that he had finally been apprehended. The man hadn't just been lurking around the police station. He had been hiding, waiting, blending into the shadows, ready to strike. The police finished their reports, and she was left alone in the quiet gas station. The shelves were disarrayed, items scattered after their struggle. The man was gone, but she couldn't shake off the horror of it all. The scars he left would remain with her, a reminder of the darkness lurking just beyond the light.